Yeah, we're here to discuss a sustainability policy called Extended Producer Responsibility and how these programs can improve recycling infrastructure and recycling practices. So what exactly is extended producer responsibility? Extended producer responsibility establishes a system in which the financial responsibility for products through the end of their life is shifted upstream to producers of those products. And how do extended producer responsibility policies work? States or countries adopt policies that may require producers to pay a fee that's associated with their goods to a producer responsibility organization. And then these organizations can use the revenues for the expansion of recycling infrastructure and for consumer education. Consumer packaging materials like plastic, like cardboard or aluminum vary, as we know, very greatly with respect to their recyclability. Some materials, such as paper, have more viable more viable markets, rather, for repurposing than others. And we're pretty good in this country at recycling paper. Extended producer responsibility policies can consider these differences in materials in their fee structure, which can incentivize producers to make more packages sustainable. For example, in Colorado, they are working to establish a program where fees will be assigned to goods based on their environmental impact. Products that are more easily reused or recycled may have a lower associated fee for the producer to pay. And difficult to recycle repackaging, like plastic films, may have a higher associated fee. And in order to pay a lower fee into the system in Colorado, producers can make packaging that has a lower environmental cost. Programs in several other states have also shown a real potential. Among them, California, Oregon, and Maine have recently established extended producer responsibility policies for packaging, regardless of the material type. As more states adopt these policies, it's critical that the federal government understand how to support extended producer responsibility efforts moving forward. We're hoping that today's discussion sheds light onto some of the activity going on in our states and what the proper role of the federal government should be. Extended producer responsibility policies can also help drive recycling rates up, since the producer responsibility organizations and governments can use the revenue they generate to improve recycling infrastructure for hard-to-recycle materials and to expand access to recycling in communities, including rural communities. Right now, consumer packaging makes up approximately a third of all plastics produced. I'll say that again. Consumer packaging makes up approximately a third of all plastics produced. And sadly, as we know, plastics are not commonly recycled in America. According to the EPA, in 2018, less than 9% of plastics were recycled in the U.S. Let me just say that again. Less than 9% of plastics were recycled in the U.S. just a couple of years ago. To put that figure into perspective, it's even smaller than the national recycling rate for all materials, which is roughly 32%. As members of this committee have heard me say more times than they want to remember, but I like to say, find out what works, do more of that. And these policies actually can work. For example, the Extended Producer Responsibility Program in British Columbia was able to achieve an impressive residential recycling material rate of 86%. 86% in 2022, up from 37% in 2004. Pretty amazing. Before the program was implemented in that country. And as we'll hear today, there's also been a surge in private sector support for extended producer responsibility policy. And why is that? We know that most Americans want to make sustainable purchasing choices, and that number is growing. According to a 2020 survey conducted by McKinsey, more than 60% of respondents said they would pay more for a product with sustainable packaging. And large consumer brands have noticed. Many companies, for example, have established ambitious sustainability goals, such as using a minimum amount of recycled content in their packaging. And extended producer responsibility policies can help producers meet those goals. However, it's worth noting that the extended producer responsibility policies on their own will not fix our waste management system. These policies must work in tandem with other investments in infrastructure and education and data collection. Fortunately, Congress has a track record of success in making such investments. As you may recall, a part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, which was actually written in this committee and managed on the floor by this lady right here and yours truly, and became law in November 2021. Our committee worked to secure $350 million to strengthen recycling infrastructure and provide recycling education grants across the U.S. of A. Our bipartisan work to strengthen our nation's recycling systems doesn't stop there. And last year, this committee adopted two other pieces of bipartisan recycling legislation at the urging of Senator Capito, Senator Bozeman, and myself, and legislation which would help gather much-needed data about a recycling system and improve access to recycling infrastructure in rural and disadvantaged communities. This Congress, Senator Capito, Senator Bozeman, and I are committed to seeing both of these bills move across the finish line. In closing, let me just say that we know that recycling is a win-win. It benefits our environment, and it can also benefit at the same time our economy. That's a kind of win-win situation that I think we all look for. And that's why our committee continues to consider further opportunities to support better recycling practices. And so we're looking forward to hearing from our witnesses today. Before we do, and we welcome you all. Thank you for joining us. Looks like you brought your family. That's SRO here in the EPW committee. But let me turn to our ranking member, Senator Capito, and thank her for her efforts and leadership. And we look forward to your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Carper, and good morning to all of you. It's nice to be here this morning. This committee's continued focus on sustainability and waste management have underscored the fact that we got a waste problem, both here in this country and around the world. Like any complex issue, it's kind of easy to sit here and list out all the problems, but it's very, very difficult to start finding realistic solutions. You have one crowd saying we need to end all plastic production tomorrow. Well, that petition just doesn't make sense. Acknowledging our continued reliance on plastic and working to prevent plastic pollution are not mutually exclusive. Private sector sustainability goals and international regulatory developments like the Global Plastic Treaty currently under negotiation indicate the waste management policy landscape is very much in flux. U.S.-based companies with global footprints are staring down an uncertain regulatory and economic future. My primary focus in evaluating extended producer responsibility policies under consideration is making sure that they're grounded in reality and consider the downstream impacts to everyday consumers, including regressive costs that could be passed down, but especially in rural areas where current recycling programs are more limited and the cost of standing up ones are more expensive. Companies cannot operate efficiently if they must conform to international standards that do not have American interests in mind, or if they have to conform with 50 different packaging and disposal requirements to sell their products, if every state had their own provisions. Past experience in other environmental areas have shown us that states with the biggest population and the most stringent restrictions will become the regulatory floor. Those states' policies then can unfairly dictate the national market to states like mine that have structural impediments to recycling access and limited resources to finding that necessary infrastructure. Preventing this outcome and a recurrence of the state-on-state fight over vehicle emission standards and its market uncertainties is why we need to bring these types of conversations about nationwide impacts of EPR policies. As sustainability shifts from marketing buzzword to a potential revenue driver and a competitive advantage, industry, government, and the environmental community must work together to achieve outcomes that protect both the environment and grow the economy. For that outcome to become achievable, we must be, in my opinion, technology agnostic and avoid mandates around EPR or circularity that may have some unintended consequences. If draconian federal standards are imposed, it may chill growth in the emerging sector, in any emerging sector. We see this happening in how IRS guidelines, for instance, on hydrogen tax credits with no basis in law are stifling the development of that market. That's particularly hitting my state and my hydrogen hub. That's why I bring it up. The same cannot be allowed to happen in the recycling and waste management spaces. During today's hearing, we're likely to hear statements such as, the devil is in the details, or if done correctly. So these precautionary labels will frequently arise in our EPR discussions. They emphasize the need to discuss all the potential consequences, both intended and unintended. Done correctly, EPR could significantly improve domestic recycling, the rates, reduce the waste, and provide new opportunities economically. Equally so, a poorly crafted EPR scheme could laden regressive financial burdens on consumers, privilege large companies over smaller companies, and open the door for targeted bans for materials out of favor, such as plastic. While I can understand the rationale behind EPR, I've yet to see a proposal that adequately is addressing all of these concerns. That's why we're here today. To start, any EPR scheme that fails to recognize the importance of chemical recycling will never meaningfully improve recycling rates. We must carefully consider what stakeholders should have a role in decision-making, such as the waste management industry, who is often left out. We also need to think about the appropriate role of government. The last thing U.S. companies need are another layer of bureaucracy to navigate. So I look forward to hearing the panel, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing.
Thank you, Senator Capito. Now we're going to hear from each of our three witnesses. We are pleased to welcome each of you to our committee today. I think we're going to hear first from Dr. H. Fisk Johnson. What does the H stand for? Thank you.
Sorry, Herbert.
Okay. The chairman and CEO of S.C. Johnson & Son. S.C. Johnson makes products many of us have in our homes and households, including Mrs. Is it Myers or Mayers? Myers.
Mrs. Myers, yeah.
Hand soap and Windex cleaners, which I've not used since yesterday.
I told him I used it last weekend.
They also have ambitious sustainability goals to make their products more recyclable and reusable. Dr. Johnson, thank you for joining us today. You're welcome to begin your testimony at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Chairman Carper and Ranking Member Capito and the distinguished members of the committee for the opportunity to talk today. This is an incredibly important topic. I am a scientist by education, but I've spent the last 37 years of my career in the packaged goods industry. And as a CEO of a large global consumer goods company that's a big user of plastic, I see plastic in two very different ways. On one hand, I see it as one of the most useful, versatile, and cost-effective materials developed in the last century that has brought extraordinary benefits to human life and well-being on this planet. On the other hand, as a lifelong conservationist, I've also seen how plastic has become one of the most profound emerging global pollutants that is affecting planetary, animal, and human health. And the challenge is reconciling those two perspectives. You know, how we as a society can and should, and most practically, most economically, and least disruptively preserve many of the benefits that plastic has brought to humanity while preventing the vast amounts of plastic that end up in landfills, or even worse, end up in the environment where it can affect animal and human health. Now, our company has a long history of environmental leadership, and I have long seen our company's plastic and packaging waste as one of our top environmental issues. And it's something that we've been working on for a very long time. You know, we launched our first 100% recycled plastic bottle 33 years ago, back in 1990. And we've continued to take numerous actions and launch many other initiatives to reduce our plastic footprint. And we're going to continue to do so, whether that's improving PCR content in our products, providing reuse, refill options, or other initiatives. However, for all our company's work and ambition on plastic, I can't say I can raise my hand and say I feel good about the progress that we've made. No matter how many innovations one company can try or efforts we can take, individual voluntary actions can only go so far. It's incredibly difficult for an individual business or even businesses as a whole to make unilateral progress on plastic waste. It takes everyone in the plastic ecosystem working collectively together, from plastic manufacturers, packaged goods companies like ourselves, retailers, recyclers, waste haulers, to individual users of plastic products, all coming together, working collectively, because scale matters. Scale at retail, scale in recycling infrastructure, scale in supply, scale in education programs, scale through everyone in the packaging value chain working together holistically. Without scale, you tend to get expensive, ineffective, piecemeal approaches. And that's why I believe the only way to have an effective program is through a government regulatory framework. And we believe federal EPR is the way to go for several reasons. For one, as you said, Americans want the government to lead on plastic waste. Two, there is a complex web of state regulations emerging which are going to drive significant complexity, cost, and dysfunction unless there is federal regulation that creates a national approach. We need federal regulation to avoid over-regulation. Efficiencies of scale matter and can only come through a national regulatory framework, and continuing to accumulate landfill waste is unsustainable. We also believe there's some urgency to get started. It's important to get ahead of emerging state regulations, but the sooner regulation is enacted and clear goals are set, and the more time that's given to achieve those goals, the less disruption there'll be to business, the economy, and consumers. Time allows for product innovation. It allows for recycling technology innovation. It allows for education programs. It allows for investment in capacity and recycling infrastructure and many other things. Now, many organizations have been working to support EPR. I think what the World Wildlife Fund has done in particular has created some excellent work to educate on EPR and how it's workable. So in closing, I'd just like to say that I believe plastic waste is a critical issue that needs to be addressed, and a practical, good way to make substantive progress is through a national regulatory framework where you can achieve scale with producers taking responsibility for the life cycle of their products. And I think the sooner clear goals and expectations are set for industry and time is given to meet those goals, the better. Thank you.
Dr. Johnson, thank you for leading us off, and we'll now turn to Erin Simon for her comments. Vice President and head of plastic waste and business at the World Wildlife Fund. Ms. Simon has been with the World Wildlife Fund since 2011. Is that right? 2011. Leading efforts to engage with the private sector to reduce plastic pollution. Ms. Simon, welcome. You're recognized for the next 5 minutes or so. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Carper and Ranking Member Capito and other distinguished members of the committee for the opportunity to testify today. Before I came to WWF, I was a packaging engineer and material scientist working at Hewlett-Packard for 10 years.
Really?
So, yeah, spent a lot of time designing packaging and for products both that were large format and went to copy rooms and stuff that ended up on Walmart shelves. So when we talk about this topic today, not only am I passionate about it, but I can talk about it from a few different perspectives.
Good, good.
World
I think
Wildlife,
that's maybe why we invited you to come.
Yeah, thanks. World Wildlife Fund is one of the world's leading science-based conservation organizations. We've been around for over 60 years, and our mission is really to protect the world's resources for future generations. and to help to address some of the biggest challenges facing our planet today, like plastic pollution. Plastics are essential to modern life. They have helped us to overcome some insurmountable challenges, but the cost of that innovation has been quite extreme, right? The U.S. is generating most of the plastic waste in the world. It's ending up in our rivers, our coastlines, and our communities. It's estimated that globally there's 11 million metric tons of plastic pollution entering our oceans every year. In just a little bit of perspective, that's a dump truck per minute. So just in the hour we might be talking, that'll be 60 dump trucks heading into our oceans. And those plastics are ending up everywhere, right? From these essential ecosystems we're trying to protect to our city sidewalks, disproportionately impacting local communities and economies, and of course, leading to the growing health crisis of microplastics in our food and water. So, to be clear, WWF is not anti-plastic. We believe plastics can be a cornerstone to many of the innovations that frame life, but they don't have any place in nature where they're ending up. Currently, we depend too heavily on the linear single-use economy, where we make, use, and get rid of plastics, and we need to turn this system, this linear economy, into a circular economy, and that's going to require a multifaceted approach that protects the communities, it protects the environment and our economies. And we see this, and our partners, some big consumer brands, as a huge untapped opportunity for the U.S. in the form of leadership, and so massive that if we were to start today to transform our plastic linear economy into a circular one, we could save more than $4 trillion in direct environmental and social costs by 2040. Policies like extended producer responsibility can be a critical part of that solution. We know EPR is responsible for robust recycling rates in other parts of the world, and it creates powerful incentives for companies to reduce their plastic footprint and design for recyclability and mitigate the risk of that leaking into the environment. EPR shifts that responsibility of end of life to the producer, and the objective is really for this physical, organizational, and financial structure to be shared between the producer and the government. It creates a more effective structure that increases the end-of-life collection, allows for better environmentally sound treatment of collected products and waste, and provides incentives to manufacturers to design more resource efficiently and invest in infrastructure. WWF has EPR principles that are broadly supported by industry and other NGOs and really include an industry-led governance model. This flexible framework is sensitive to regional differences, but would ideally be established at the federal level. In this type of model, governments have the oversight over the system, but hand the day-to-day management and funding obligations to an industry-led producer responsibility organization, or PRO. In my written testimony, I provide more details of that and our recommended parameters for a successful EPR system. WWF hopes that the conversation this committee is leading today will help pave the way for Congress to develop and enact EPR legislation. And we're not alone in that. We have a proven track record working with companies on to improve their footprints and advocate for policy. In my written testimony, I'll elaborate on our work with companies like Coca-Cola, Mars, and Walmart. These companies support well-designed federal EPR, as well as corporations further up the line, like Dow. Policymakers can also act knowing the American public is firmly behind you. I know there were some stats listed, but soon to be released from WWF, some public polling will show that 85% of the public agree that plastic waste pollution is a serious and concerning problem that requires immediate political action to solve. So this issue is one we can all agree on. And ultimately, a circular economy is the only sustainable way forward. EPR can help us to get there. And both government and industry aligned on the need for the best-in-class system. Here in Congress, we have seen the passage of Save Our Seas, and members of this committee have introduced the Recycling and Compostability Accountability Act, and the Recycling Infrastructure and Accessibility Act, and the Break Free from Plastic Act. These efforts demonstrate the bipartisan recognition of this growing problem and the keen interest in addressing it. We believe well-designed federal EPR provides another opportunity for Congress to pass bipartisan legislation. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and thank you for the committee's leadership.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And thank you for, sounds like a lifetime of leadership in the private sector and again, in the nonprofit sector. Thank you. Finally, we're going to hear from Dan Felton. My sister and I grew up in Danville, Virginia. And one of my favorite places in Delaware is Felton, Felton, Delaware, just south of Dover. They have a fire company there. We have a lot of volunteer fire companies. I'm sure my colleagues have in their states. And people ask me, they say, where should I go to dinner in Kent County, Delaware, which is Greater Dover? I always say the Felton Fire Hall. So I just want to, that where your name is revered in our state. And we're honored that you're here with us today. And I understand that you are executive director, how do you pronounce it? American Pen represents a wide range of stakeholders in America's packaging supply chain, and we're delighted that you're here. Thanks. Please proceed.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Carper.
Let me just say, our witnesses can't see this, but we're having an interesting movement of people that it keeps coming into this committee hearing room, the likes of which I've not seen in a long time. And a lot of them are young people. It looks like they're maybe college or high school age. And I think they're interested in recycling. And that's a beautiful thing. And we're happy to see this kind of, by their presence, so they're saying this is good stuff. And we agree. Please proceed.
That's democracy at its
Amen.
best.
It sure
right?
is.
Good morning, Chairman Carper, Ranking Member Capito, and members of the committee. I am Dan Felton, Executive Director of AmeriPen, the American Institute for Packaging and the Environment. I very much appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today on this important topic of extended producer responsibility for consumer packaging. This is a core issue for AmeriPen, and it's a core issue right now for the U.S. packaging industry. All stakeholders must work together to craft and implement effective shared responsibility solutions for packaging recovery and recycling. AmeriPen supports that. AmeriPen is the only material inclusive trade association representing the entire packaging value chain in the U.S. That's material suppliers, packaging manufacturers, brand owners who use that packaging, retailers, and end-of-life material managers. Our membership also includes a broad array of industry, product, and material-specific trade associations who are essential to the fabric of AmeriPen. We focus on science and data to support our public policy positions, and our advocacy and engagement is based on rigorous research rooted in our deep commitment to achieve sustainable packaging policies. Packaging plays a vital role in the United States, ensuring the quality of consumer goods as they are manufactured, shipped, stored, and used, protecting the health and safety of the Americans who handle and use those products. Packaging has value throughout its life cycle, and none of it belongs in roadways, waterways, or landfills. We know how to recover it and be recycled and reused, and no one knows better how to do that than the AmeriPen members who design, supply, produce, distribute, collect, and reprocess that packaging. They're driving innovation, designing packaging for better environmental performance to boost recovery and recycling and evolve the existing infrastructure. AmeriPen supports public policy positions that are results-based, effective and efficient, and equitable and fair. This has been the bedrock of our advocacy work, as 4 states have now enacted full packaging EPR laws, and 2 additional states have enacted groundwork laws. We will support thoughtful packaging EPR proposals that properly balance the needs of all stakeholders. We will not support poorly designed packaging EPR proposals that we believe are not based in reality and will not result in positive environmental change and greater packaging recovery and recycling. We were deeply involved in the legislative process for each of the states that have now enacted EPR packaging laws, and we are now deeply engaged in their implementation. There is unfortunately a lack of consistency between these emerging laws and the additional proposals we are seeing come forth in the U.S., causing concern for many, including brand owners who will be the primary responsible party for funding those programs. More detail on this is included in my full written testimony submitted for the record today. A deeper discussion is now merited on how uniformity may be achieved if packaging EPR continues to expand in the U.S. and whether something could or should be done at the federal level. To that end, AmeriPen would be pleased to work with federal policymakers and other stakeholders to explore the potential need and design for any federal framework or program. While AmeriPen is not currently suggesting there is an immediate need for a federal program or framework, any consideration must balance multiple public policy priorities and stakeholder needs to effectively improve packaging recovery and recycling throughout the U.S., alongside the need to keep existing systems and infrastructure operational and profitable. A national nonprofit producer responsibility organization, a PRO, would likely be needed to manage the organizational structure for any program that moves forward for producers to develop a national program plan, pool resources, and provide program funding. A federal government entity, such as the Environmental Protection Agency, would likely need to have oversight of the PRO and the organizational mechanisms to coordinate with states in their existing management of solid waste and recycling. Phasing in interested states through an opt-in process to receive federal support might also be appropriate to allow the continued planning and management of solid waste and recycling at the state and local levels. Such an opt-in process should establish national standards for terms, data, measurement, and reporting, and the use of producer funds to which in-state stakeholders must adhere in order to receive that funding. This type of framework that retains state and local planning while also providing greater funding, consistency, and efficiency through national standards could provide a workable approach to integrating aspects of packaging EPR across the country without creating a national takeover of local recovery and recycling programs. I hope these thoughts from Ameripen offer some perspective today on any national packaging framework or program that might be considered. I very much appreciate the opportunity to appear before the committee today, and I would welcome any questions you may have. Thank you.
Good. Well, we welcome each of you today. Thanks for your life's work. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us and our colleagues and our guests. We've heard. We're going to provide 5 minutes per member for questioning, and I'll try to keep us close to that. But we'll offer opportunities for multiple rounds. I hope. But I would just say to Simon and Dr. Johnson, with respect to fee setting, we've heard in your testimonies that a system that assigns fees based upon the environmental impact of a product is an important aspect of an extended producer responsibility policy. For example, difficult to recycle plastic films may have a higher fee than a recyclable cereal box. Question start with Ms. Simon, if you would. Would you expand for us, please, on how this fee-setting process can work as a tool and extended producer responsibility policies to support both downstream and upstream changes in our recycling system?
Absolutely. So when we talk about this fee setting, the term that is being used often today is called eco-modulation. It's a way to...
What's it called?
Eco-modulation. I don't know if it's a real word. But
I have words like that, too.
spell check does not like it. But what it essentially is about is sort of a fee modulation around criteria for the packaging, right? So if we want to improve our recycling system, we need to start by making sure that we are standardizing the design of those materials to match the technology and the infrastructure. By doing that, you get better efficiency on the back end, higher quality materials. They'll have a higher value to have longer term contracts, right? And so to incentivize that, to incentivize design for that, you can create a fee modulation system or an eco-modulation where you incentivize producers to design for that system or design above that, right? Use recycled content, use less. And you can also disincentivize, right? You can disincentivize problematic materials, problematic colorants, labels, additives, so that they pay a higher fee, right? That way they are no longer, if they are degrading the quality of that feedstock, they are paying to degrade it. Additionally, it can create the need for transparency in the system, which can help avoid some of the concerns around toxic chemicals in recycling. If there's better transparency, the material recycling facility will have the ability to opt out of those materials, and it'll give us the opportunity to have better visibility of how we improve upon reducing those problematic chemicals in the future. So fee modulation is a way to sort of take a tool that could be just for financing recycling and use it for a bit more than that.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Dr. Johnson, would you please share with us any views that you have regarding the same topic.
Yeah, I would just simply say that I would support as a key tenet of EPR this kind of eco-modulation. And what we've seen in some EPR schemes is they create a pollution prevention hierarchy. So, the worst being plastic going into landfill, waste to energy, downcycling to recycling to reuse, refill, and fees are based on where, the end of life of your product is relative to that hierarchy. And I think it's a good incentive system for companies like ourselves to make our products more recyclable, to improve our PCR content, and just have continuous improvement in the system. A number of EPR schemes don't have that, but we would certainly promote having that kind of system in EPR.
All right, great, thanks. Senator Capito.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. There is a fundamental chicken and the egg issue here that is preventing us from moving on. Insufficient collection infrastructure hampers our recycling efforts, and the low demand for recycled materials discourages investment. That's why I think extended producer responsibility could really be viewed as a potential solution here, which is good. Ms. Simon just mentioned something that I mentioned in my opening statement, and so, Mr. Felton, I'd like to ask you, is it even feasible for producers to comply with anticipated recycling content mandates without the integration of some chemical recycling? Where does chemical recycling fit into this? Because obviously it's a major part of the materials that are produced.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. It's a great question. And while Ameripan doesn't have an official public policy position on advanced recycling, chemical recycling, molecular recycling, we will say it is a tool in the toolbox. And we would not want any program at the state or the federal level to move forward that would take a tool that is, enabled to increase packaging, recycling, and recovery. That would include new emerging technologies for mechanical recycling, and as well, we believe that would include these new technologies, newer technologies to support advanced or chemical recycling.
Dr. Johnson, do you have an opinion on that as well?
Yeah, I would support the fact that it's an important tool in the toolbox, especially for hard to recycle plastics. And you would hope over time that, as EPR works, you get out of those hard-to-recycle plastics and you put more into the recycling loop, and maybe there's less of a need for that kind of tool. But it is certainly an important tool, in my opinion, in, an interim period.
Ms. Simon, do you have an opinion? You mentioned that in your...
Overall, I think we are cautious about chemical recycling today, as it hasn't quite proven. However, I don't think we need to define the how. I think we define outcomes in the process, right? We don't want to close off innovation, but we say that any technology that is used to process and provide us secondary markets has to meet certain environmental, social, and economic bars, right? So if we set a system up to be about outcomes, about improving the benefits of this system, then we don't have to put barriers up around what those tools can be.
So, one of the frustrations I think the chairman and I have, if I can speak for him briefly, I think, is that we can't even get our small recycling bills through Congress. So how in the world are we going to be able to do something on a federal level at the scale at which that we're talking about here, which would be, I think, beneficial fundamentally to everybody in the country, and all the states would be able to comply. But the two downsides that I mentioned were possible regressiveness in terms of cost of product. As you further recycle, what does that do to the cost to the general consumer? And the other thing is the rural America sort of inability to access recycling now, but in the future. So I don't know, Mr. Felton, do you have any helpful hints here for Congress?
And included in my written testimony is some more examples of this. But yes, I think there are things that are moving forward that Congress can help with. The acts that we've heard of today, the Recycling Infrastructure and Accessibility Act, the Recycling and Composting Accountability Act, understanding they are currently facing challenges as well. But those are steps in the right direction. I think another thing that could be helpful, and I don't think it's impossible to do, is to get some more harmonization or uniformity, if you will, around the definitions. I would agree with Ms. Simon's, discussion about, what is the end goal, what's the end game here, but if we're all operating from a different definitional standard, that's something to think about. One other thing I would highlight that I think is very important that I do see an opportunity potentially for federal government to support is the re-emergence of state recycling market development. So we want markets for these materials at the end of the day. Producers want that to get to those recycled content, either self-imposed or mandates states are putting forward. Recycling market development is another tool, and I think there is a role here for the federal government to potentially help in that regard.
You mentioned in your statement that I think you said 4 states had already put in enhanced.
That have full EPR laws in place right now.
Okay,
yes.
what 4 states are those?
That's Oregon, Maine, Colorado, and California.
And then what were the other 2? You mentioned 2 others.
Illinois and Maryland have passed what I'm referring to as a groundwork law. It will do a needs assessment.
Are these in conflict with one another, or are they similar?
I would say that, generally speaking, none of these 6 laws in place now are quite like each other. They are definitely.
So Mr. Johnson's products, are they going to be impacted? How are they impacted by the state laws?
So there is some conflict between the state laws. I'll give you an example. The labeling laws as part of EPR in California will prevent the chasing arrows symbol in most cases, whereas 30 other states have laws that mandate the chasing arrows. And our products flow pretty freely across state borders, so it would be impossible for us to comply with the law when you have that kind of labeling conflict.
Right.
That's just one example.
Well, that's a good example. I mean, that's a good example of why harmonization would really be where we need to go here.
Yes.
It just on something that sounds pretty simple can complicate things. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you very much. I would just say to our colleagues, two of us that are sitting here on this side of the dais are former governors and very much involved in the National Governors Association. And there's an entity within the National Governors Association which it's a mechanism that enables states to share ideas with one another, what's working, what's not working, and they actually have a name for the committee that does that. I used to chair that committee, and so I would remind us this is not just a federal issue, it's not just a private sector issue. The states have a real dog in this fight, and we welcome that. Senator Capito has her father was governor of West Virginia when I was born, and well, rumor has it that she has a son who might end up being governor of West Virginia in the future. So, as governors, we want to keep an eye on them and make sure they're part of what needs to be done. Senator Ricketts, he and I are recovering governors.
Great. Thank you very much, Chairman Carper and Ranking Member Capito. Appreciate the opportunity. And thank you to our witnesses for being here today. EPR is a relatively new approach to address our plastic waste infrastructure. And I have some concerns that relate to something that, frankly, none of the witnesses addressed directly, which is the financial burden this could place on complying with that regulation and what was going to do to the price of goods. A study from the state of New York showed the adoption of EPR could increase grocery bills $36 to $57 a month for a family of 4. And this is at a time, of course, when inflation is already impacting families across this nation. Grocery prices are up 21% since Joe Biden has taken office. And, of course, who does this harm the most? Well, it's our lowest income families, are the ones that are the least able to handle these price increases. And we see this in a lot of areas, with low-income households, they consume almost 20% of the prepackaged goods more than other households. And we have all sorts of examples where regulation comes in place and it drives up costs for consumers, and of course that impacts our consumers all across the board. So, for example, When California passed some of their animal cruelty laws, it drove up the price of eggs 33%. And if you look right now in California, on Proposition 12 as well, eggs consistently cost 85 cents more than in California, or 85 cents to $1 more in California than they do in the Midwest. Or if you look at, for example, the EPA's proposed tailpipe regulations that would require 2/3 of all electric vehicles to be sold in the United States by 2032 to be electric vehicles. Electric vehicles generally cost $65,000. That's significantly more than a regular internal combustion engine. And the average low-income household spends $12,000 on their vehicle. So again, a huge impact on low-income families when you have regulations come in place. So this overregulation can have a big impact on our families that are the least available to do it. And especially when you're talking about basic necessities like food and transportation, they're really the most vulnerable. Now, in Nebraska, we actually have innovation that could also help with this. It's development of bioplastics. Nebraska is a leader in the development and production of these types of chemistries. The previous Farm Bill expanded the definition of bio-based products to include renewable chemicals. Renewable chemicals are produced from renewable biomass, allowing sustainable materials to be mixed with conventional materials in existing industrial processes and supply chains. It's widely used internationally, and the USDA has been slow to adopt these improvements. Mr. Felton, can you talk a little bit about the importance of innovation and provide some examples of important innovations that are happening in the packaging supply chain?
Yeah, thank you, Senator, for that question. And there is a lot of innovation happening. Bioplastics is one example. There are other innovations happening able to incorporate, for instance, more recycled content. And what I would say is I want to try to answer both parts of your comments. One is the innovation happening, right? And it's important to remember that packaging is designed for a particular reason, a particular purpose. And I would even suggest in some instances that would be more true in your state with more rural communities, right? And people may go to the store a distance and maybe be once a week, once every 10 days. So there's packaging designed expressly for that purpose, for them to be able to purchase products and have it last longer, quite frankly. So innovation, whether it be bioplastics or other types of materials, packaging being produced, really is meaningful when we have this more holistic discussion about extended producer responsibility, which then goes to the cost issue, right? And you referenced a study. There are studies sort of on both sides of the aisle. Does EPR increase cost to consumers? Does it not? I think economics would argue there may be some incremental, at least small cost to consumers at the end of the day. I would suggest that consumers may have some of that cost impact. Companies may be willing to internalize some of that cost as well if it gets to what they're trying to do as a company. I'm sure Mr. Johnson can speak further to that, but it's definitely a consideration. My members are very concerned about potential cost increase, but I think if they can find paths forward to meet their goals, whether it be environmental or to sell more products, if they can internalize some of that cost, the impact will be less, quite frankly.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Johnson, can you talk a little bit about what innovation in the packaging industry?
Certainly. Just to comment on the cost piece, I share your concern, and its impact, especially on people that can't afford these kinds of cost increases. But I would make a couple of points. One is if we let this, emerging round of state regulation happen, that's going to drive costs a lot faster than if we have federal regulation. The second thing that I would say, and this is one of the things I'm promoting, is that the sooner we get federal regulation and the more time given to meet goals, the more innovation can happen, the more you get economies of scale, and you can mitigate the costs and inconvenience to, the people that buy our products. I advocate for time to meet these hurdles. But there are a lot of innovations happening, particularly on recyclability of products and recycled content. I think those, and reuse, refill kinds of innovations, those are, I think, the three big things that will be promoted in EPR regulation.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Not at all, thank you. And thank you for always showing up. This guy has, I think his attendance is as good as mine. And so just a joy to continue to work with you. Senator Padilla's joined. Senator Padilla represents a big state, California, and does it extraordinarily well. As you know, I used to be a naval flight officer, and we were stationed when we weren't in Southeast Asia in the Vietnam War. Our squadron we were housed at Moffett Field Naval Air Station, and I lived very close to there in Palo Alto. And when we weren't overseas, I would recycle. And I found a warehouse about a mile from the apartment that some of my buddies and I lived in, and we go there pretty regularly every month, and I've never stopped. Good habit that I learned a long time ago in your state. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for convening this hearing as we explore the role of extended producer responsibility. I think it's helpful to remind ourselves that it's just one aspect of the circular economy for plastic. These policies should obviously work in tandem with other areas like recycling infrastructure investments, which we've talked about, improved data collection, because that can help inform future decisions and policymaking, and any other strategies that would leverage public-private partnerships and investment to achieve our goals. As the chairman said, I'm proud to represent California, who I believe has paved the way towards a circular economy for the benefit of both consumers and the environment. Thanks to California's leadership on recycling over the years, we've collected over 491 billion bottles and cans, including the ones that you recycled, Mr. Chairman. 1 billion pounds of carpet, right? Maybe a lot of people are familiar with the cans and bottles, but it's not just that. Carpet, 2.6 billion pounds of e-waste, because of electronics and its disproportionately impactful environmental damage if not disposed of properly. 2.2 billion gallons of used oil, and 9.6 million mattresses for recycling. I mean, we're going to take recycling and reuse everywhere we can find it. California is also one of the first states to enact extended producer responsibility legislation, with this landmark passage of SB 54 in 2022. This law requires producers to reduce single-use plastic packaging by 25% and make 100% of their packaging either recyclable or compostable by 2032. And reports estimate that the targets in the law would result in 23 million tons less of single-use plastics over the next 10 years. That sounds like a big figure. Let's try to envision what 23 million tons is. You familiar with the Golden Gate Bridge? 23 Golden Gate Bridges is what we're talking about, or 150,000 blue whales. Dr. Johnson, how can Congress best advance extended producer responsibility policies while also protecting states' abilities to act?
I do think there's an important role for states. What we would like to see is harmonization of product labeling, product characteristics, so that because our products flow freely across state borders, so that we don't have conflicts of laws and we can capture good economies of scale. To me, those are the two most important things that we need from a federal level, but states obviously should have, a lot of capability to design these systems to meet their state's particular needs.
Right. And I think in addition, this is my position for the record here, I think we in Congress can learn what's worked at the state level and try to broaden that across the country while not preempting those states that can and want to be even more aggressive. It's an important balance and policy relationship to have. Now, in my time remaining, I want to touch on at least one other topic. California was one of the first states to pass a beverage container deposit law, which established what Californians know as California's redemption value, the CRV, on beverage containers. Now, this fee, or deposit, as it's referred to, is either returned to consumers when they recycle their bottles and cans or given to a curbside operator or nonprofit recycler. And thanks to California's bottle bill, our beverage container recycling rate is at 70%. We've had higher marks at some point, but 70% is pretty successful. Ms. Simon, what other complementary recycling systems should be considered and incorporated into federal extended producer responsibility policies?
Thank you so much for the question, and thanks for your leadership. I think it's really important that we learn from what the states have been doing and what really creates sustainable secondary markets for all materials, because we do know that we are way outpacing the world's ability to produce all of the things we depend on, and we need to figure out how to get them back. So there's a lot of elements that we would build into a system like EPR that could extend beyond single-use products, right? You can learn from DRS to create, and how the incentives work in that, to enact incentives for reuse systems and recovery in the shared community. You can create better harmonization and design standards across a whole host of different product categories, right? We are primarily talking about municipal solid waste here and single-use materials, but there is apparel, there is electronics. There's a lot of other industries that are going to learn from what is happening in this space, and we should be considering those as we look at what type of mechanisms could be successful in helping us to recover those unneeded resources in one place and provide them for other industries in another.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Chair, I'll just remind us that recycling is the third of the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, and then recycle. Back to you, Mr. Chair.
The 3 R's. Can't get away from that. You mentioned the Golden Gate Bridge, which a lot of us are familiar with. There's also a Golden Gate Park. And when we were not deployed overseas, my squadron was back in California, and I got to go to the very first Earth Day in Golden Gate Park. And the speaker that day was Ralph Nader. And he had written a best-selling book, some of you may recall, called Unsafe at Any Speed. It was written about my car, the Chevrolet Corvair. It's an air-cooled engine in back, and it had a way of going around the curve. You go around a real sharp curve. It would like change directions, and you'd find yourself going the opposite direction. And the other thing we found out is that in the winter, when you turn on the heater, carbon monoxide would come out of the heater. So when I was at Ohio State, I bought it when I was like a senior at Ohio State. And when the young women at Ohio State found out that my car was a Corvair, it was hard to get dates in the winter. And but I lived to make it to Pensacola, Florida, and sold it for $1. And bought myself a Volkswagen Karmann Ghia, which I think I ended up with like 200,000 miles on it. So, but it started with the Corvair Monza, great memories. And I want to say thank you for your leadership in California, and thank you very much for your leadership here. We have a bunch of all of us serve on a number of committees. I have served on about 3 or 4 others, and some of my colleagues do, and a lot of those committees are meeting right now. And our members are going to kind of try to pop in as to the extent that they can. But until they do, I'm going to proceed to just to ask questions. My next question would be of Dr. Johnson of you. But several countries, as we may know, including Canada, and I think France is one of them, have established extended producer responsibility laws. And recently, I think we've had some mention here today of Colorado, Maine, California, and Oregon have passed their own laws for consumer packaging. We've heard both pros and cons to these laws. And one concern we've heard from stakeholders is about the challenges we've heard here today, of the challenges of a patchwork state-by-state approach to recycling policies, such as differing labeling requirements. I mentioned the National Governors Association actually has an entity that is in place for to actually share good ideas with one another, and to find out what works and do more of that. But the question is called Center for Best Practices within the NGA, and it's a great organization, still very active, and we try to work with them in ways that are helpful to the federal government, to Congress, and also to state and local governments. Dr. Johnson, a follow-up question for you. Would you please share some of your experiences as a global business working with national and international extended producer responsibility laws, and what are some of the challenges that SC Johnson has faced in complying with these laws, and how might the regulatory entities address those challenges?
So I think there's some good models of EPR legislation out there. I would hold British Columbia up as an excellent example. You shared that as an example earlier, Senator, where they've been able to achieve high recovery rates and very high access to recycling for the population in British Columbia. Some of the challenges that we've had, revolve more around transparency of fees. The one thing that I would like to see more of in extended producer responsibility regulation is more of a push on reuse and refill. And that is, probably one of the best approaches to minimizing environmental impact. And I'd just like to share an example, if I could. 12 years ago, we launched a concentrate which you could put in this Windex bottle and fill it with water. So you can reuse this trigger bottle, 100 times if you wanted. It's got, that is the best environmental footprint for this kind of product. But it doesn't sell very well. Most consumers, plastic is just not top of mind enough for them to want to go through the inconvenience of putting a concentrate in here and refilling this bottle. And it just comes back to it's very hard for an individual company to make progress with these kinds of innovations. But if we have things in the regulation that could help incentivize these kinds of things and bring scale at retail, if retailers had 30% of their space devoted to refill, reuse options, if, many companies created those options for their brand, if we had education programs, if we had subsidies, that could help this kind of innovation. France has put in their regulation a minimum amount of retail space that you've got to devote to these options. The United Kingdom is giving subsidies for refill stations in Europe. We have over 700 refill stations for a laundry detergent brand in Europe. And those kinds of things work, and I would love to see that kind of added to a regulation that we could have federally here in the United States.
Okay, thank you for that. Ms. Simon, and again, probably Dr. Johnson, but we'll start off with you. Ms. Simon, as I mentioned, I think in my opening statement, some materials have more viable markets for repurchasing than others, as you know. It's known as end markets. I believe that's what they call end markets. So, for example, paper is recycled at almost 70%. And recycled paper is often put back into products for resale. But plastic products do not have the same recovery rate or value as a recycled product. A question, I think for you and maybe for Dr. Johnson as well. How can extended producer responsibility policies establish new end markets for recycled materials? Ms. Simon.
Well, every single one of the materials that we depend on for single use today, whether it's paper, aluminum, glass, or plastic, comes from a resource and comes with impact, right? So we should be making our best effort to make sure all of those materials are getting recycled. And they all end up in the same blue bin. So when we're talking about an extended producer responsibility scheme at the federal level, we need to be considering all of those materials at once and how we can create design standards and eco-modulation to enhance and improve the way those materials are designed for recycling and for the infrastructure and technologies needed to most efficiently recycle them so that we have high-value materials on the back end for all of that, right? So maybe the improvement from paper up is, not as high as it would be because we have a much lower starting point for other materials, but that improvement is still needed because paper and paperboard are the materials within that blue bin that absorb the most of the contaminants, right? And because they are on the lower end of the amount of times you can recycle them, those contaminants actually have a bigger impact on the strength of those fibers when they're being recycled. So I think there is mutual benefit that can happen across all materials for those secondary markets.
Thank you. Dr. Johnson?
I would just say that a key tenet of extended producer responsibility regulation and a key responsibility of the producer organization is to help create those end-of-life markets. If you look at the British Columbia example, today over 99% of what they collect goes into an end market, and that's been improved over time. And again, I think eco-modulation is an important tenet as well. You create a plastic pollution hierarchy, and you create an incentive system to move products from going into landfill or waste to energy up to higher value, more circular markets. And to me, that's a very helpful and important principle in extended producer responsibility regulation.
But let me just follow up with that. Would say, how important are viable end markets for a company like yours that's trying to use more recycled content in your packaging materials?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
How important are viable end markets for a company like yours that's trying to use more recycled content in packaging materials?
It's extremely important, and it, what regulation does is it creates scale. It creates scale and supply of post-consumer recycled plastic, which is important to us because we're meeting our own internal goals of using recycled plastic. It's important for us to see that even today, some of the hard-to-recycle things get into even downcycled markets. So to me, it's a critical part of regulation.
Good, thank you. I think that's my questions. I think those are my questions. I want to mention a couple of things if I can. Senator Capito, Senator Bozeman, and I have provided leadership in introducing two significant pieces of legislation to deal with recycling. We've talked about it many times in this room. Some of you are familiar with them. They passed out of committee, I think unanimously. We have very broad support within the Senate, and in an effort to try to reconcile our legislation with what's going on in the House, we've stumbled over something. It's called in the Senate. It's called a hold, H-O-L-D, and a member of the Senate, Democrat or Republican, put a hold in some cases on legislation that he or she has concerns about. One of our colleagues, Senator Lee of Utah, has lifted his hold. He has lifted his hold, we learned this morning, on the two recycling bills that this committee has moved earlier in this Congress that we talked about here even today with Senator Capito has provided a lot of leadership on that, along with Senator Bozeman and our staff's great staff work on that, and we appreciate very much the decision by Senator Lee to lift his hold. We're going to be, Senator Capito and I are going to be working, and our staff's going to be working with, we call it with the floor. I don't know how you work with the floor in the Senate, but the folks who work the floor for the Democratic and Republican leadership, to see if we can't move these two recycling bills as soon as possible so we can work with the House to get them to President Biden's desk. So it's a piece of good news. We don't always have good news, but that's good news, and we're real happy and grateful to Senator Lee for what he has done. Before we wrap it up, one of the things I like to do, well, I'm always looking for consensus. How do we build consensus? How do we build consensus here across political lines? How do we build consensus between the House and the Senate? How do we build consensus with states and governors and other levels of government? I'm going to ask you in closing, if you would, just to maybe close with each of you with like a thought or two in terms of actually taking us closer to consensus on something, an issue of significance relating to recycling. It could be what we're talking about today. It could be something else that's related to what we're talking about today. But what, and just a fact, maybe we're not asking a question that triggered a response. What else do you think you want to kind of leave us? You had a chance to give an opening statement. I want you to give just a short closing statement with some real wisdom, and you've already given us a lot of that already. I'm going to ask Mr. Felton if you would just lead us off, and then we'll wrap it up with Ms. Simon.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. Three quick thoughts. One is consensus is critical, and we need people at the table. And I'm not suggesting the people here in the room today are not at the table, but one thing American has discovered over the last 4 years is we're only going to solve these problems if all stakeholders sit down together, and that is what consensus is. So encourage those who are not currently engaged in this issue to follow hearings like this, understand the complexities of it, and move forward with us. Two other things I want to say. I do want to mention that while we have, I believe 40 countries around the world that have EPR in place, many of those programs were set up 20 and 30 years ago for a different set of packaging, a different set of technology. These programs are continuing to evolve, so as we point towards other countries and what they're doing right. I think we need to be mindful of that, and we need to be mindful that I think we need a unique United States solution as well for the way that things are set up here in the United States. My last comment is data, data, data. We need data.
You say data?
Data, yeah, I did 3 times. We need that desperately. And I think there's a role for the federal government to help with that. So as we're looking to find consensus, looking to drive industry interests and environmental interests and state interests, is we lack data that is desperately needed, and we need to work more on that.
Good. I think one of the pieces of legislation that, one of the 2 pieces I talked about,
it does
speaks to that issue, and which is good. So
yeah,
we've been responsive. Thank you for the encouragement. Dr. Johnson.
You know, I would just say, obviously, consensus is important. Far be it from me to suggest what might help build that. I would just say that, you know, given the emerging state regulations, that federal regulation will help prevent over-regulation. And I think that should be important for everybody. I would also say that this is an important emerging issue. I know you talked about microplastic last week. That, I think, is becoming a very important human health issue that needs to be solved. And I think if there's anything with urgency around it, it's that. But I appreciate the opportunity today to share my views. So thank you.
We're delighted you could join us again. Thank you for sharing your views with us. Ms. Simon.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the opportunity once again. When you talk about consensus, it makes me think about the process that's happening in parallel to this in the United Nations around the treaty, where it is the goal, right, for all of those member states to come together and find a common path forward against a shared threat. And that is really hard to do in quite a divisive world, as it can be to find paths forward in the U.S., but an interesting thing has emerged in these negotiations and in the momentum in the U.S. is that where we have common ground from more players than ever before is on extended producer responsibility. We may have different reasons for why we want it, but ultimately we all need better, more harmonized standards. We need better collection, we need better processing, and we need better secondary materials. So that is fairly common, and I think why you see more excitement and activity from the private sector on this. They want that more than anything. I want to add one thing. I didn't get a chance to comment on the cost thing earlier, and I was hoping I could just add a few thoughts. Pardon?
You didn't get,
On the cost to the consumer. I think the cost is already on the consumer in the form of plastic waste today, and municipalities that are currently dealing with that. So I think we need to make sure we're considering where these costs are falling as we do the full balance sheet for what an EPR system would do. Mayors in the Midwest, part of the Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative, talk about cost as one of the challenges they faced in how it's coming down to the local taxpayers. Those mayors will be on the Hill tomorrow to talk about their support of EPR also. And Washington has done some studies that have shown that there are benefits to it, coming back in the form of $600 to $300 a year by not having to pay for trash services. So I think there's an opportunity to find that common ground and where there can be those benefits to businesses, those benefits to the government, and those benefits to the communities who really need it. So thank you again for the opportunity and appreciate it.
we thank you all. I hope your work provides you as much joy and satisfaction as our work provides for us. People who follow the news and follow what goes in Washington think that we don't like each other, can't stand working with one another. And that could not be further from the truth, at least with respect to many of the issues before this committee. We have a lot of mutual respect. We have a great, I think, great track record in things like the Inflation Reduction Act, which we were involved in helping to write, and the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which has huge climate provisions in it, that some of which we talked a little bit about here too today. But Winston, not Winston, I was going to say Winston Churchill, but another great leader it's a statue of him is a couple of miles from where we're gathered here today, and it's our former president, Abraham Lincoln. And one of my favorite Lincoln quotes is, in response to the question, what is the role of government? What is the role of government? And Lincoln used to say the role of government is to do for the people what they cannot do for themselves. The role of government is to do for the people what we cannot do for themselves. There's a lot of wisdom in that. And one of the ways that the government works best is when we do it in a collaborative way and look for common ground, trying to find ways to harness market forces where that works, and realize that there's a moral imperative for this. This is the only planet we're going to have. There's no planet B. And we've got to take care of this planet if we care about our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. And I know if we're lucky enough to have those, that we want to make sure they have a wonderful place to inherit and to raise their own families someday. But we appreciate your thoughtful insights into what can be a complex topic. And we look forward to remaining in touch with you if we can find you. In a good way, and we want to stay in touch with you and with our committee, so that we can really reach some of the best, most thoughtful policies and advance these and other shared goals. I want to say a special thanks to Senator Capito, to her staff, to our majority staff, and to the staff of all of our colleagues who participate in helping to select you to be our witnesses, and provided some of the questions that have been asked here today. I get to do a little bit of housekeeping here to close out our hearing, and I want to ask. This is my favorite part of the hearing. I want to ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a variety of materials that include letters from stakeholders and other materials that relate to today's hearing. And when I ask unanimous consent, and there's no other senator to object, then I can pretty much run the show. So without objection, there you go. Senators are going to be allowed to submit questions for the record through the close of business on Wednesday. That's March 20th, and we'll compile those questions. We'll send them to our witnesses, and we'll ask all of you to respond, if you could, by Wednesday, April the 3rd. And in a place where sometimes we don't have great news every day, the news about our friend Senator Lee lifting his hold on our recycling bills is a wonderful piece of news. And I think folks who might have been tuned in across the country are probably encouraged by your testimony and what you've presented to us today and the questions that our members ask. While you've been testifying here for the last almost hour and a half, we've just had a really impressive group of young people coming into the hearing, and there's the seats for folks who might be watching us on C-SPAN or television. You have a number of people can sit in the hearing room. We have seats for maybe 50, 60, 70 people, and but we've had probably 100 or more young people. They look like they're in maybe high school or maybe college that are coming. They could have gone to any hearing. We have a lot of committees. They could have gone to any hearing. They could have gone to see the House in order or in session or the Senate over in the Capitol. They came here. They came here by the dozens. And they came here because they know this is important. And this is important for them in their lives and the families that they'll raise someday. We don't want to let them down. We don't want to let them down. And I'm proud to say that I think on this committee we're not letting them down. And with your help, we'll continue to do that. And with that, this hearing is a wrap. Thank you all very much. We're adjourned.